Imagine carrying a promise for 3,150 years, centuries of exile, persecution, and destruction, yet a flame of hope that never extinguished. The history of the Jewish people is one of the oldest and most resilient in human history. Amid wars, massacres, and unimaginable tragedies, something kept them standing. The unwavering belief that one day they would return to the land God had promised their ancestors. But has that promise been fulfilled as many believe? Or is there more to this journey of liberation and faith than we've been told? The birth of Israel in 1948 was the realization of a dream that once seemed impossible. But the story leading to that moment is much deeper and full of surprises. Stay until the end, because we will offer a powerful prayer, connecting ourselves with the lessons this people left behind. And of course, subscribe to the channel. Hit the like button and join us on this transformative journey. Abraham lived in a distant land, surrounded by traditions that no longer reflected the truths God wished to convey to his people. Amid the comfort of routine, he hears the divine call, "Leave your country, your people, and your father's household, and go to the land I will show you." Abraham, already advanced in age, did not hesitate. With unshakable faith, he gathered his family and belongings, determined to follow the voice of God. The covenant made at that moment was the promise that would echo through generations, laying the foundation for a resilient people. The journey was not easy. They faced deserts, uncertainties, and long days without knowing when their journey would end. However, Abraham kept the flame of hope alive. He knew that faith was the fuel driving him. God had promised that his descendants would be as numerous as the stars in the sky. The surrounding landscape may have seemed hostile, but the divine promise shone brightly in his heart. With each step, he reinforced his trust in future liberation, certain that God's purpose would not fail. Abraham was not alone in his journey of faith. Sarah, his wife, shared in the hardships and, at times, the doubts. Already in old age, the promise of a child seemed impossible. Yet God had a greater plan. "Why did you laugh, Sarah?" the angel asked when predicting Isaac's birth. "Is anything too hard for the Lord?" The laughter of disbelief turned into laughter of joy. Hope was renewed. Isaac was born, sealing the promise that Abraham would be the father of many nations, a covenant that would transcend time. The promised land, Canaan, lay before their eyes. Upon arriving, Abraham built altars and called upon God, solidifying the faith that would move generations. Each altar was a reminder of the promise, a symbol of resilience amid the difficulties yet to come. The promise that his descendants would inherit that land was unshakable, even though the reality at the time may not have seemed clear. Abraham understood that faith is not based on what is seen, but on what is expected with conviction. Abraham, the father of many nations, taught that the path of faith is not free of trials. There were times when the promise seemed distant and liberation unlikely. However, Abraham's resilience was his greatest strength. He maintained his trust in God, even when called to the greatest test of his life, the sacrifice of his own son, Isaac. Climbing the mountain with a heavy heart, he was ready to give up what was most precious to him. But at the last moment, God provided the lamb, symbolizing that true faith is always rewarded. The promise to Abraham echoes to this day. He lived a life marked by faith, hope, and resilience. The journey that began with a simple call became an eternal legacy. The liberation he experienced was more than a physical journey to a new land. It was a spiritual liberation, a reconnection with the divine purpose we all seek. Abraham showed that true hope lies in trusting that God always fulfills his promises, even when the challenges seem insurmountable. Abraham's covenant with God did not end with his life but was perpetuated through his descendants. For generations, the Jewish people would remember this divine agreement as the beginning of their own story of faith and liberation. Every time they faced difficulties, they turned to the promises made to Abraham, finding in his story the fuel needed to continue. This covenant became the foundation of an identity that would overcome deserts, exiles, and persecutions. And so Abraham's legacy not only marked the beginning of a promise, but also laid the groundwork for what was to come. The journey of faith that began with him would continue in his people, shaping the identity of Israel. And it is in this continuity that we begin to understand the significance of the next chapter of the story, the liberation of the people of Israel from Egyptian captivity, where a new covenant would be forged and the faith of a people would be tested once again. The oppression in Egypt seemed endless. The once prosperous Jewish people had been subjugated and forced into slavery. For centuries, their hopes for liberation were sustained only by the promises made to their ancestors. However, God had not forgotten his covenant with Abraham. The call came to Moses, a man initially hesitant to accept his mission. "I will be with you," God said, ensuring that the promise of liberation was near. The faith of the people was about to be tested in a radical way. With Moses leading the way, the liberation began. The plagues that struck Egypt were a clear reminder of divine power. With each event, the faith of the Jewish people solidified while Pharaoh's resistance slowly crumbled. The 10th plague, the death of the firstborn, was the final blow. In the still of the night, the Jews prepared to leave. The desert awaited them, but the promise of a new land filled them with hope. Crossing the Red Sea would be the first great sign that God was with them. The sea parted before their eyes. The impossible became reality. Moses, with his staff raised, commanded the wind that separated the waters, creating a path of liberation for the people. The Egyptian soldiers followed closely, but the hope of the Jews grew with every step they took on dry land. When they finally reached the other side, the waters returned, crushing Pharaoh's army. Liberation had arrived, and with it, a new chapter in the history of Israel. The desert, however, brought new challenges. The journey was arduous, and the people often found themselves filled with doubt. "Why did you bring us out of Egypt?" they lamented, mourning the hardships of the journey. But Moses guided them with patience, and God provided. Manna fell from the heavens, water sprang from the rock, and the hope of a promised land never completely left them. It was a time of learning, where the people's resilience was shaped and their faith refined, forging a new identity for Israel. On Mount Sinai, the covenant was renewed. Moses went up to meet with God and returned with the tablets of the law. "I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of Egypt." The words echoed through the mountains, engraving themselves in the heart of every Israelite. The laws they received were not just rules, but a new covenant reinforcing the divine promise. The faith of the people was now anchored in a stronger alliance, and the desert was no longer just a place of trial, but also of transformation. 40 years in the desert were not in vain. With each step, the people of Israel learned to trust more in God. It was a time of purification, where the hope for a new life in the promised land kept the nation united. Despite the setbacks and the harsh reality of an apparently endless journey, the promise was never forgotten. Moses, with his unwavering faith, constantly reminded them that the land of Canaan awaited them. The people's resilience prepared them for the future. At the end of the pilgrimage, the new generation of Israelites was ready to enter the promised land. Moses, now old, knew he would not enter, but the legacy of faith and liberation he had left was immeasurable. He gazed upon the promised land from afar, trusting that his people, nourished by faith, hope, and resilience, would find their way under Joshua's leadership. The story of the Exodus would forever mark the Jewish identity as a people who would never bow down, no matter the size of the oppression. Thus, with the crossing of the desert coming to an end, the next challenge awaited, entering the promised land and the battle to conquer Canaan. With Joshua leading, the people of Israel saw the promised land before them. The long journeys through the desert were behind them, and now the horizon was full of hope. Canaan, the land God had promised to Abraham, was within reach. However, the conquest would not be easy. The people would have to fight for this final liberation, an effort that would require faith and resilience. The walls of Jericho, towering and seemingly insurmountable, were only the first obstacle to overcome. But Joshua knew that God would fight for them. Crossing the Jordan River was marked by a miracle similar to the one at the Red Sea. The waters parted, and Israel crossed the river safely. On the other side, Joshua received specific instructions from God. March in silence around the city for 6 days. On the 7th day, the walls will fall. And so it was. At the sound of the trumpets, the walls of Jericho crumbled, and victory was secured. This initial triumph not only reignited the people's faith but also reinforced the divine promise that Canaan would be theirs. Canaan was inhabited by various peoples, each with their own armies and fortified cities. The battles were intense, but the resilience of the Israelites had been forged in the desert. The faith they had learned to cultivate during the years of wandering sustained them in the midst of struggles. Joshua, with his inspiring leadership, guided the people with the certainty that full liberation was within reach. Each victory reinforced God's covenant with Israel, and each defeat reminded them of the need to trust completely in the Lord. Over time, the land was conquered and divided among the tribes of Israel. At the end of his life, Joshua reminded the people of the promises God had fulfilled. "Choose this day whom you will serve," he challenged. "As for me and my house, we will serve the Lord." This declaration was not just a personal choice, but a call to the nation to maintain its identity amid external influences. Faith and hope were the foundations that would sustain the people, but history would show that this would not always be easy. After Joshua's death, Israel entered a period of transition. Without clear leadership, the tribes faced both internal and external challenges. The period of the Judges was characterized by cycles of disobedience, oppression, and liberation. When the people strayed from God, their enemies oppressed them. But in each moment of affliction, God raised judges to rescue Israel. The people's resilience was tested repeatedly, but the promise of liberation remained alive. Each judge, from Deborah to Gideon, personified the renewal of hope. The period of the Judges also revealed the constant struggle of the people to maintain their faith Despite their victories, Israel often found itself seduced by the gods of neighboring peoples. This led to cycles of suffering, but also of repentance and redemption. The people were never far from liberation, for God, faithful to his promise, always answered the cry of his people. The hope of a united and faithful nation to God remained a beacon guiding them through the darkest times. During this period, the story of Samson, one of the most iconic judges, stood out. His physical strength was immense, but his spiritual weakness led him to destruction. However, even in his weakness, Samson asked God for one final act of liberation, and so it was. He brought down the pillars of the Philistine temple, sacrificing himself to bring a final victory for Israel. This story, among many others, symbolized the constant struggle between faith and temptation, but also the certainty that hope was never lost. At the end of the period of the Judges, the people of Israel cried out for a king to unite and lead them. This desire for strong, unified leadership marked the transition to a new era, the era of the kings. The promise of a great and prosperous nation was more alive than ever, and the faith that had been forged in the desert and during the battles for Canaan now paved the way for the reign of David, Israel's greatest king, and the beginning of a new phase in the history of the Jewish people. The rise of David to the throne marked the beginning of a new era for Israel. From shepherd to anointed king, David was chosen by God to lead his people into a period of great prosperity and liberation. Under his leadership, Israel united like never before, overcoming enemies and consolidating its identity as a nation. David's faith was unwavering, as demonstrated in his victory over Goliath and in his compositions in the Psalms, which are still symbols of hope today. Jerusalem became the capital of Israel, and God's promise was manifested in every victory. The construction of the temple in Jerusalem, a dream that David could not fulfill, was left in the hands of his son, Solomon. This temple would be the spiritual center of Israel, a place where the faith of all the people would converge. Under Solomon's reign, Israel reached the height of its prosperity. Solomon was known for his wisdom, and the peace that reigned in the land was seen as a reflection of God's blessings on the people. The promise that Israel would be a great and prosperous nation finally seemed to be coming true. However, not all was peaceful. In his quest for political alliances, Solomon married many foreign women and allowed them to bring their gods into Israel. This created spiritual tension among the people, and faith in God began to be challenged by external influences. The resilience of the nation was tested, and the seeds of division began to be planted. Solomon, despite his wisdom, could not maintain the purity of worship of God in Israel, and his death marked the beginning of a period of uncertainty. With Solomon's death, the kingdom was divided into two parts, the kingdom of Israel in the north and the kingdom of Judah in the south. This division weakened the nation both militarily and spiritually. Each kingdom had its own kings, many of whom strayed from God's laws. While some tried to bring the people back to faith, others succumbed to idolatry. The promise of prosperity and freedom seemed increasingly distant, and the people of God faced new internal and external struggles. The northern kingdom of Israel was marked by a succession of kings who frequently deviated from God's ways. Idolatry became commonplace, and the hope of unity slowly faded. The people's faith, once so strong, began to weaken, and the consequences of these choices soon became apparent. Civil war and attacks from neighboring nations were constant. The promise of God, which had seemed so close during the reigns of David and Solomon, now felt like a distant memory. The liberation they longed for grew increasingly obscure. Meanwhile, the southern kingdom of Judah managed to maintain a closer connection with God, though it too faced periods of idolatry and rebellion. Kings like Hezekiah and Josiah tried to restore the people's faith, removing idols and renewing the covenant with God. Despite their best intentions, the people frequently wavered between faith and the temptations of external influences. Judah, however, resisted more than Israel, maintaining a resilience sustained by the promises made to David. The hope of restoration remained alive, albeit faint. The division between Israel and Judah culminated in wars and invasions. The northern kingdom was the first to fall, conquered by the Assyrians. The Israelites were taken into exile, and the 10 northern tribes disappear. The promise of liberation seemed shattered, and many lost their faith. However, in Judah, hope persisted. The people knew that despite the difficulties, God still maintained his covenant with the line of David. They believed that even in times of darkness, final liberation was still to come. With the northern kingdom in ruins and the southern kingdom facing pressure from all sides, the Jews looked to the future with uncertainty. Internal division had weakened the people, but God's promise, though obscured by circumstances, was still a source of hope. The faith and resilience that had sustained Israel for so long would be tested again with the coming of the Babylonian exile, one of the most painful moments in Jewish history, where the people would be torn from their land and the temple would be destroyed. The Jewish people, torn from their land, saw their temple destroyed and their identity threatened. The faith that had always been their pillar of support now needed to be even more resilient. Through tears and lamentations, the people found themselves distant from the promises made to their ancestors. How can we sing the songs of the Lord in a foreign land? This question echoed in their hearts, but the hope of liberation, though fragile, remained alive. God had not forgotten his people. In Babylon, the Jewish people faced the harsh reality of living under foreign rule. However, even in a distant land, their faith kept them united. Prophets like Jeremiah and Ezekiel proclaimed words of hope, reminding them of the promise of return. "For I know the plans I have for you," declared the Lord, assuring them that exile would not be the end. The hope of liberation was renewed, and the people's resilience manifested in their continued devotion, even far from Jerusalem. During the exile, Daniel stood out as an example of unshakable faith. Even surrounded by a foreign culture, he refused to abandon his traditions and beliefs. When challenged to worship other gods, Daniel remained firm, praying to God daily, even knowing it could cost him his life. Thrown into the lion's den, his liberation was a clear sign that God was still with his people. Stories like Daniel's rekindled hope among the exiles, reminding them that God's promise would not fail. As the years passed, Babylon fell to the power of the Persians, and a new opportunity presented itself. King Cyrus, inspired by divine will, proclaimed that the Jewish people could return to their land. This decree brought immense relief, a liberation many no longer believed possible. Caravans began to organize, and the return to Jerusalem became a reality. God's promise was being fulfilled, and the hope that had kept the people united during the exile now guided them back to their land. The return to Jerusalem was a moment of deep emotion. The city, once majestic, now lay in ruins. The temple, the symbol of Jewish faith, had been destroyed. However, the people would not be disheartened. Led by men of faith like Ezra and Nehemiah, They began the process of rebuilding. Brick by brick, the temple was raised again and hope was restored. The faith that had sustained the people during exile now drove them to rebuild not only their homes, but also their relationship with God. The return was not without challenges. The tribes that had remained in Canaan viewed the newcomers with suspicion, and many tried to prevent the temple's reconstruction. However, the people's resilience was greater than the adversities. Nehemiah, with one hand on the sword and the other on the construction tool, symbolized the faith and courage needed to rebuild. God's promise of restoring Israel was being fulfilled, and the people once again saw their identity being strengthened. With the temple rebuilt, the people of Israel renewed their covenant with God. Ezra read the law to all, reminding them of the promises made to Abraham, Moses, and David. It was a moment of reflection and hope. The faith that had kept them firm during the exile now guided them toward a future of liberation and prosperity. Israel's restoration was not only physical, but also spiritual. The people knew that their resilience had brought them this far, and that God still had great plans for them. The exile and return showed the people of Israel that even in the darkest moments, God's promise never fails. The faith, hope, and resilience that sustained them in captivity now guided them in the rebuilding of their nation. But Israel's story was far from complete. The Persian rule would eventually give way to new powers, and the Jewish diaspora would spread even further. The destruction of Jerusalem and the Second Temple at the hands of the Romans marked the beginning of a new phase of trials for the Jewish people. The diaspora, the scattering of Jews throughout the world, began in full force. The temple, the spiritual center of Jewish faith, had been reduced to rubble, and the people once again found themselves uprooted from their land. However, despite the tragedy, faith and hope did not extinguish. The resilience that had characterized the people over the centuries now became even more essential for their survival. The Jews were scattered to the farthest reaches of the Roman Empire and beyond. In each new land they faced oppression, distrust, and prejudice. But God's promise still echoed in their hearts, fueling the hope of eventual liberation and return. Even distant from their homeland, the Jewish people kept their tradity. Synagogues became spiritual centers that replaced the destroyed temple, and faith continued to be practiced with devotion, serving as an indestructible link to their origins. Life in the diaspora was full of challenges, but also of opportunities. Amidst the dispersion, the Jewish people demonstrated unparalleled resilience. In each new community, they established their traditions and teachings, creating a global network of culture and faith. Even when persecuted, their faith in God and the promise, the hope for eventual liberation and return to the Promised Land, was passed down from generation to generation, like a flame that would never die. The diaspora also brought a rich exchange of knowledge and cultures. The Jewish people, in contact with various civilizations over the centuries, preserved their identity while influencing and being influenced by the peoples around them. Their ability to adapt without losing a sense of who they were enabled them to survive even in the most hostile env. They knew that liberation would not come easily, but their faith in God's promise kept them strong. The hope for a better future was stronger than any oppression. Anti-Semitism emerged as a constant threat during the diaspora. The Jewish people faced persecution in different parts of the world, from Europe to the Middle East. Pogroms, expulsions, and massacres marked the history of the Jewish diaspora. Yet faith was never abandoned. Even in the darkest moments, Jews kept hope alive. The words of the prophets, which had comforted the people during the Babylonian exile, now echoed once again, reminding them that God had not forgotten them. Festivals and religious rituals became even more important during the diaspora. The celebration of Passover, for example, recalled the Exodus and the liberation of the Jewish people from slavery in Egypt. The hope for a new liberation, this time from spiritual and physical exile, was renewed with each generation. The promise that God would bring them back to their land remained central to Jewish identity. And so in every corner of the world, the Jewish people continued their journey of faith and resilience, keeping their identity and traditions alive. As the centuries passed, Jews began to settle in more stable regions where they could prosper. From the Iberian Peninsula to Eastern Europe, The Jewish people left their mark on various cultures and societies, but always maintained a deep connection to their history and faith. In times of crisis, they turned to the promises made to their ancestors. The diaspora, though painful, did not break the Jewish people's faith. On the contrary, it strengthened their hope for liberation and return. However, the diaspora would not be the final chapter of the Jewish people's history. God's promise to restore his people in the Promised Land continued to resonate throughout the centuries. The diaspora, despite its pain and challenges, was also a phase of preparation. The desire to return to the land of their ancestors never died. And in the 19th century, this desire began to take shape in a new and powerful way. The Zionist movement, born from the resilience and hope of the Jewish people, would be the next step toward the fulfillment of this ancient promise. In the late 19th century, after centuries of dispersion and oppression, the dream of a return to the Promised Land began to take concrete shape. The Zionist movement emerged as a response to the latent desire for liberation and the restoration of the Jewish people to their ancestral homeland. Theodor Herzl, a visionary journalist and thinker, became the face of this struggle. Herzl believed that the faith and hope of millennia could be transformed into political action. He declared, "If you will it, it is no dream." The promise made to Abraham could finally be realized. The Zionist movement found support in various parts of the world, especially among Jews who had faced relentless persecution in Eastern Europe. Pogroms and forced expulsions drove many Jews from their homes, but also reignited the desire for a safe and sovereign home. Faith in God's promise and hope for concrete liberation kept the spirit of Zionism alive. The first Zionists began migrating to the land of Israel, working the land and establishing agricultural communities. It was a new beginning, but one full of challenges. The resilience of the Jewish people, forged during centuries of diaspora, now found a new battleground. The political and social tensions in Palestine, still under Ottoman rule, created obstacles for the Zionist pioneers. However, the desire for liberation was stronger. The people knew that, just as Abraham had walked that land centuries before, now it was their turn to fulfill the covenant. Every new colony that arose was a symbol of renewed hope, of the faith that had never been lost, even in the darkest hours of Jewish history. Leaders of the Zionist movement, such as Chaim Weizmann, used their diplomatic skills to seek the support of world powers. The turning point came in 1917 with the Balfour Declaration, in which the British government expressed its support for the establishment of a national home for the Jewish people in Palestine. This international support renewed the hope that the promise was about to be fulfilled. The faith in the return to Zion, as old as the people themselves, now seemed closer than ever to becoming a reality. The dream of liberation was beginning to take real form. However, the path to the creation of the State of Israel would not be simple. The Jews already in Palestine faced growing tensions with the local Arab communities who viewed Jewish immigration with suspicion. Additionally, the Holocaust, which devastated European Jewish communities during World War II, made Zionism not only a matter of faith, but of survival. The liberation the people sought was no longer just a spiritual promise. It was an urgent necessity to save lives. The world watched as the Jews fought for their right to exist. The tragedy of the Holocaust united the Jewish people around the idea of a Jewish state. The images of millions of Jews being brutally murdered by the Nazis shocked the world and highlighted the need to ensure the safety of the Jewish people. The Zionist movement gained political and moral strength, driven by the cry for justice and liberation. The promise that God would return his people to their land could no longer be delayed. The faith and hope that had sustained them for generations now had to be transformed into decisive action. In 1947, the United Nations General Assembly voted in favor of a plan to partition Palestine, creating both a Jewish and an Arab state. For the Zionists, this was the confirmation that the divine promise was being fulfilled. Faith in Abraham's covenant was finally materializing in a land where Jews could live in freedom and security. However, joy was quickly accompanied by conflict. Many Arab countries rejected the plan, and war loomed. The Zionist movement, however, did not retreat. On May 14, 1948, David Ben-Gurion, one of the most influential Zionist leaders, declared the establishment of the State of Israel. On this day, the dream of generations is realized, he proclaimed. The Jewish people, after 3,850 years of struggle, exile, and hope, had finally restored their homeland. The liberation that began with Abraham passed through the Exodus and endured the exiles culminated in the founding of Israel. However, new challenges would soon arise with war imminent. The joy of the Declaration of Independence was almost immediately overshadowed by the threat of war. The very next day, 5 Arab armies invaded the newly created State of Israel, determined to destroy the enemy. The Jewish people, who had endured centuries of persecution and exile, now faced another monumental challenge, but the resilience that had sustained them for so long, the same faith that had brought them back to their land, now motivated them to fight with everything they had to defend their new homeland. The War of Independence was long and difficult. Many thought that Israel would not survive, that the dream of liberation would be crushed before it could even blossom. But the Jewish people, driven by their deep hope and determination, resisted. Thousands of volunteers, both local and international, joined the Israeli forces to protect the new nation. For many, this fight was not just for a piece of land, but for the fulfillment of a promise that went back to the times of Abraham and Moses. Every battle won was another step toward realizing that dream. Amid the war, Israel also dealt with a massive influx of Jewish immigrants from all over the world. Holocaust survivors, Jews persecuted in Arab countries, and other exiles arrived in large numbers. The promise of liberation, of a safe home, was finally becoming a reality for millions of Jews who had dreamed for centuries of returning to the Promised Land. Integrating all these new citizens was no small challenge, but faith in a better future and hope for prosperity sustained the young nation. With the war's end, Israel emerged victorious, but the struggle was far from over. Conflicts with neighboring countries would continue for decades, but the resilience of the Jewish people, forged over millennia of exile, guided them. The nation, though young, began to flourish. God's promise that Israel would become a great nation was slowly being realized. The liberation that once seemed like a distant dream was now a reality. Israel was no longer just an idea. It was a homeland, a refuge, and this realization brought renewed hope for the future. In the years that followed, Israel developed rapidly. From a country born in the midst of war, it became a technological and military powerhouse. Agriculture flourished, cities grew, and the Jewish people re-established themselves in their land. The faith that had sustained them for centuries now manifested in every achievement. Israel was a living symbol of hope and resilience, a testament that God's promise never fails. The people knew that although there were challenges ahead, their faith and determination would lead them to new liberations. The birth of Israel in 1948 was not just a milestone for the Jewish people, but for the entire world. It was the fulfillment of an ancient promise, the culmination of a long journey of exile and suffering. At the same time, it was the beginning of a new phase where hope and faith would continue to guide Israel in its future challenges. The Jewish people, who had never lost their identity or faith, now had a place to call home. And this liberation, so long awaited and hard fought, echoed in every corner of the new nation. Although Israel's independence marked the fulfillment of a promise, the people knew that their journey was far from over. New challenges awaited, both internally and externally. The story of the Jewish people, marked by faith, hope, and resilience, would continue. The birth of Israel was a dream realized, but it was also the beginning of a new chapter, where God's promise would guide the nation in its path to the future. Israel's story was now entering a phase of construction, both spiritually and physically. And so, after 3,650 years of history, we see how the faith, hope, and resilience of a people can overcome any adversity. From the covenant with Abraham to the creation of the modern state of Israel, each step of this journey teaches us powerful lessons about perseverance and the importance of maintaining faith, even in the most challenging moments. But what about you? What does this story awaken in you? What area of your life needs this strength and confidence to keep fighting and believing in the promises God has for you? If this story has impacted you in any way, share in the comments what touched you most and how you plan to apply these lessons to your own journey. And of course, if you haven't already, Subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell to continue learning about topics like this. Leave a like so that more people can connect with this message. And now get ready, because we're going to offer a powerful prayer together, asking God to strengthen us with the faith and hope we saw in the journey of the people of Israel. Lord God, eternal and mighty Father, today we turn to you with hearts full of gratitude and reverence. As we reflect on the long and extraordinary journey of your people, from the times of Abraham to the present day, we are reminded of your unshakable faithfulness. Every step of this story teaches us that, even amid the greatest adversities, you always keep your promises. Just as you guided the people of Israel through the desert in times of captivity and dispersion, we also trust that you are guiding us in our own lives. Help us to have the faith of Abraham, the hope of Moses, and the resilience of those who never gave up, even when all seemed lost. Lord, may each of us learn from this story. In our personal challenges, daily struggles and trials, may we never lack the confidence that you are in control, and that liberation, restoration, and renewal will come in your perfect timing. We ask, Father, that you give us the courage to persevere, even when the path seems difficult, and the wisdom to see beyond the obstacles, knowing that your purpose is greater and better than we can imagine. Strengthen our faith, renew our hope, and guide us on the path of your truth. May we live according to the promises you have for us, trusting that just as you led your people through the centuries, you will also lead us on our journey. In the name of Jesus the Christ we pray. Amen.